If you think tariffs are just trade politics, you are already behind. The US just slapped new tariffs on Nordic countries, not over manufacturing, not over security, but over Greenland. And here's the part that no one's saying out loud. When tariffs become leverage instead of policy, prices spike, markets wobble, and high earners get hit first through portfolios, taxes, and inflation. Today, I'll show you exactly where this lands on your money and what to do before it does. So today we obviously have the biggest story, which has come out of the US and then subsequently out of Davos and the World Economic Forum. And that is that President Donald Trump has slapped new tariffs on several Nordic countries in order to persuade or cajole them into making an agreement on giving the United States Greenland. And the 8 countries affected: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Finland. There is a 10% tariff that is supposed to start February 1st. This is from CNBC. And that tariff will rise to 25% on June 1st. We're going to get into this big story and also talk about how it applies to ourselves. So stick around for that. So that's the announcement that was made. Obviously, in Davos, Switzerland, right now, there is the annual World Economic Forum that is going on. Several leaders, both from governments, from businesses, many elites, all meet in Davos, Switzerland to talk about economics and finance with each other every year. So that is what has kicked off today. There was an interview, one of the first ones of the day, with the IMF chief. IMF, this is not referring to anything in Mission Impossible. The IMF refers to the International Monetary Fund. Just some background, that was established in the 1940s after the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, and it mainly managed fixed currency rates. That system collapsed in the 70s, and now it just kind of brokers deals and manages finances between countries. So the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, was interviewed. And this article from CNBC says that she issued a stark warning to European leaders on Tuesday, that's today, and that message is, get your act together. So that's a very blunt message. And this is directly in response to the new tariffs proposed by Donald Trump. And we already mentioned the countries that can be impacted. France already spoke out against it. And then there was an additional 200% tariffs suggested on French wine because of that. So very stern action from the U.S. It seems like they're not interested in taking any prisoners on this. And the IMF chief says, we are on the record multiple times appealing to the Europeans to complete the single market, to concentrate on their domestic competitiveness. Europe has fallen behind in productivity. Europe has fallen behind in getting small companies to grow to giants, and that has to change. And so here what Kristalina is saying, she's saying that we need to expand the European Union, make the countries within the European Union and view it as a trade bloc. They need to work more closely together. And she probably also means expand the Eurozone. So not all countries within the European Union use the euro, but many do. And something that I heard from Thomas Sowell popped in my mind when I read this, and it's that he's never met a bureaucrat that didn't think if they only had more money and more power, could they solve the problem at hand? And that's kind of what this sounds like. And it seems like there's a strong push for independence. And if you've been watching my channel, you would think that that's something I'm on board with, right? She's talking about independence. But if you read a bit closer, she's talking about European independence. She's saying that it's impossible to compete when they have 27 different energy systems. If you cross the border from Germany to France, you can't work there. She says it's time to seize this opportunity and build a new independent Europe. So she's not talking about German sovereignty and France sovereignty and Spain sovereignty. She's not talking about them as independent countries. She's talking about them as an independent Europe. She wants one energy system. She wants anyone within the European Union to be able to work somewhere else within the European Union. It's almost making of a new country and treating each of the European countries as their own states. Because if you look at the total GDP, if you look at the European Union as a whole, the United States is at about almost 31 trillion in GDP. The European Union as a whole is 21 trillion. So it's still about 2/3 the size of the US, but in her mind, that at least makes them a bit more competitive. And then if they try and negotiate together, they can get a better deal. I see where she's going with this. She finishes up, though, last year, many got very excited about tariffs. And many were projecting a recession. It did not happen. Why didn't it happen? Because economic rationale took over. So she admits that the U.S. has played this game before and frankly won. They played this game before and they won. It really didn't cause the big, dramatic, economy-crushing blows that everyone speculated it would in the media. Now, today, obviously, as it impacts all our own money, the S&P went down 1.3%. That's the biggest drop since October. So let's talk about that first. So the market went down. I don't see this as a huge issue. If you remember, the stock market went down a lot more than that, and maybe there's more room to fall, who knows? But the market went down a lot more than that last year when there were tariff threats. And then once some deals started to be made, the market reversed and normalized to where it had been before. So who's to say that we're not just seeing more of that? But just down 1.3%, if you looked at the news, you would think that the market went down 10% today. You would think the market went down 20%. You would think the sky is falling, that a new trade war has been triggered and will never come to an agreement, and everything's falling apart. But again, the market's just down 1.3%. And let's put this all into context with the actual GDP numbers. So the United States, like I said, almost 31 trillion. The European Union, if it were to act together, 21 trillion. In the number 2 spot, you have China, which is 19 trillion. And then in the number 3 spot, you have Germany. And so on the surface, you'd say, wait, Germany is the 3rd largest country by GDP in the world. They are the biggest member, therefore, of the European Union. Surely that means that they have some weight to fight the US on this. But wait, what does it mean to be in 3rd place? To be in 3rd place with GDP, it means that they have a $5 trillion GDP. And remember, the USA is at $31 trillion. So economically speaking, China is 4 times Germany, and the US is 6 times Germany. So you can say, oh, we have some large economies, and together they are larger, but still, none of them, even together, none of them individually, certainly, but then even together, they still do not match what the U.S. is. And the question comes back to, do they really have a hand to play here? And I'd say that the answer is no. For example, the U.S. has lent tremendous support to Ukraine because Europe couldn't do it alone. They needed the U.S. A lot of these countries have given up their sovereignty, and we'll get back into the GDP numbers, and this time we'll view it per capita. If we go by the IMF's ranking, I'm going to ignore the first several countries. Many of them have a high GDP because they're extremely small, and they're typically considered, wealthy tax havens. So we have Monaco, Liechtenstein, Singapore, Luxembourg. You get the picture. But when we get to truly sizable countries, we have the first one, Norway. What's notable about Norway? They are not in the EU. They are not in the Eurozone. Yet they were hit with these 10% tariffs. And do you know what their response was today? Their response was, well, we're not going to retaliate, and we're going to try and resolve this diplomatically. That was it. That was it. There was no calls to get your act together and rally the troops, and we have to all bind ourselves together to fight, because they have, while their total GDP doesn't match the US by any means, but they have a very high GDP per capita. They have they have tremendous resources, and in addition to that, they converted those tremendous resources, their oil reserves and industry, into $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, right? They've protected themselves. So even if high tariffs do come up, will it hurt a little bit? Sure. But at the same time, they can weather it for a bit and hopefully make a good agreement. So they've set themselves up. The number 2 country, again, ignoring all the small ones, Switzerland, also notably not part of the EU, not part of the Eurozone. So Norway's GDP per capita, roughly $107,000 per person. Switzerland, $98,000 per person. And then as we go down the list, we get to the US, just under $90,000 per person. Denmark, $84,000 per person. They are in the EU and part of the Eurozone. And then obviously they control Greenland, so they're in the spotlight. So they are strong relatively as far as GDP per capita, but then they also lack on the military end of things. And the list goes on. You have the Netherlands. Notice a lot of these countries, Iceland, with a Germanic descent, right, are quite high on this list. Then we have Belgium, Austria. I'm skipping all the other countries. I'm just sticking to Europe. And then you have Germany down at 73,000, Switzerland 73,000. So even then, they're 3/4 of what the U.S. does. And granted, so for Germany to even be in the 3rd spot, despite it only being $5 trillion, is actually very remarkable. Norm Macdonald had a joke about Germany is that when they decided to go to war in the early 1900s, they didn't just pick another country, they chose the world. And it was a bit of a close fight. And then 25 years after that, when you got to World War II, they decided to go to war again with the entire world. And it was another close fight. And so Germany obviously has proven to be a very tough country, at least over the last 100 years. They then descended into terrible times after World War II, being nearly completely destroyed, split in half. Half of it was run as a horrible communist country. And still, after all that, they were able to come back and be the 3rd largest country economically as far as GDP speaks. But at the same time, if you look at the last 30 years, they shut down their nuclear power plants and became energy dependent on Russia. And so that puts them in a tight spot when trying to support Ukraine and deter Russian aggression, right? They've joined the EU. They've given up their currency, right? There's no more Deutschmark. They use the euro. And so when you hear the IMF chief say, hey, we've been on the record multiple times appealing to Europeans. We need a single market. We are stronger together. Well, wait a minute. 2 of the, economically speaking, strongest countries on a per capita basis are not part of the European Union, and they're not part of the Eurozone. Now, the strongest Germany is, but as far as we could tell, Germany essentially carries the EU. And perhaps Germany would have had the strongest GDP per capita had they stayed out of the EU and stayed out of the Eurozone. That's all speculative. So the first thought, again, on how this affects us, it spooks the market. Denmark, one of their, what's called their academic pension fund. This is a pension fund for professors and teachers. They announced that they're selling $100 million, that they will sell $100 million worth of treasuries. And so that spooked the market a bit. Again, I'm not concerned about the impact on my portfolio for this. And if you think about it, that was one of the leading stories on CNBC all day, that Denmark, that one of their pension funds plans to sell $100 million worth of U.S. treasuries. Now, just some context. This pension fund, it's not a true pension fund as the U.S. would consider it. It's more like what we would consider a 401k, because it is a contribution defined plan, not a benefit defined plan. When you hear pension in the United States, you think of a benefit defined plan, which means you pay in some made up number and then hopefully you get some made up number back by the time you retire. And that's all made up by, whatever government is arranging the pension. That's made up by them in terms of issuing more debt or taxing their citizens more to pay off all the pension holders. But a contribution defined plan is based on you put concrete dollars in that you get to choose, and then that grows in the market and you get that money back. It's not a made up calculated number that true pension funds often miss. So that's what this particular fund is. It's a fund for teachers, right? So we know that there's a good chance that it's liberal leaning, that they probably didn't like what Donald Trump was doing in the first place. In addition to that, they have strong ESG requirements. They've divested their fund of oil and gas companies, right? And so it's not surprising that they would take a stand in this way. The total fund is about $25 billion. So this was a front page story on CNBC all day. And you would think that it would have this massive impact. But in reality, small foreign teachers investment fund announces intent to divest even smaller portion of U.S. treasuries. That isn't as exciting. But in reality, that's what's happening. But I guess any of the potential real fear could be if this is a signal for perhaps an actual sizable player divesting of U.S. treasuries. And that's something that Ray Dalio, when he was interviewed at Davos today, mentioned. And he said that's where this could go. Countries could start fighting over capital investments. And they could say, well, we're going to sell your bonds. We're going to sell your tech stocks. We're going to pull our money out. Will they really? Time will tell. The U.S. tech sector has been on fire for several years, going up and up and up. It would be very difficult. It would be a very difficult call for a foreign fund manager to announce to everyone we are going to stand on principle and divest of what has been highly successful investments all over Greenland. And they appeal to the idea of international law. But in reality, all of them know that the international law is what the U.S. says it is. The international law is what China says it is. And for whatever reason, they have given up, many of these countries have given up their autonomy, and they have thought that they were going to be stronger together. And in reality, it doesn't seem to have panned out. So that's the first point. That's how the market could be affected. Obviously, it's down today. We'll see if that affects investments long term. And then the other bit that we can take away from this is viewing these geopolitical circumstances on an individual basis. Some of you know where I'm going with this. I can say, well, the US can be successful, China can be successful because they try and be independent themselves. They try and protect their own currency. They try and protect their own markets. So you could view Norway as an example. They built a giant fund. How does this apply to us individually? You can build up a giant nest egg. You can try and stay out of debt. You can set yourself up such that when big troubles happen, they aren't that big. For example, if you are racking up debt and you're not paying attention and you're busy doing sports betting or you're busy on TikTok all day long, you may be in for a real shock when you or a family member has a medical scare, if you have a car accident, if something happens to your home, if you have a job loss, all of these things, right? View all of these in the context of Denmark, right? I think Denmark may have been very complacent for many years. They might be somewhat strong on a per capita basis, but they're not the strongest overall. And now they're met with a question of, one of the territories that they own being of interest to another country, and what recourse do they really have? For all intents and purposes, Denmark has basically been watching TikTok videos and doing sports betting in their spare time instead of trying to enhance their own sovereignty. And so I think that's something that we can take away. Try and be more like a Norway, where you're trying to build your own sovereignty, you're trying to build a nest egg and prepare for a storm, as opposed to a country like Denmark or like France, who then isn't ready for the storm and then tries to appeal to all their friends to try and help them. I know from personal experience, the friends I like to help are the ones that never ask for help. Because if you're a friend that constantly asks for help, and then even if the issues continue to escalate, well, if you're the person helping them, then it starts to feel like, well, geez, this person's really they're really a drain. They can't really get it together, and they're kind of dragging me down. Maybe I need something in return. And I think that's how the U.S. is acting right now. They're saying, well, geez, Europe is really felt like a drain. They felt like a drain with NATO, and that was corrected a bit, but now they're still feeling like a drain. And the U.S. is turning around and saying, hey, yeah, we actually want Greenland, and we know you can probably give it to us because you're dependent on us for many, many things for decades. And it's time to pay up. We want something in return here. Whereas if Europe had been far more sovereign and robust and strong, then maybe they wouldn't be in this position. And maybe whoever's running the US in the future would think twice about trying to get some of Europe's land. So those are the thoughts for today. One, let's not be too worried about market downturns in all of this talk. And then two, try and see what's happening with these countries and how that can reflect on your personal life and how you can try and shore up your own finances to be ready to weather the storms, as opposed to being that friend that just always needs help and then having to just fall in the arms of all your other friends when the big issues happen. I'm not saying shun a community entirely, but I'm saying also don't just fully lean on your community nonstop without getting your own house in order. Have a good night.